They thought they were bullying a helpless kid at the neighborhood gate. But when he unclipped that badge, their smirks vanished, and the entire power dynamic flipped in an instant. I'll never forget the moment I saw my 16-year-old son Marcus standing at our neighborhood gate, surrounded by 3 grown men in HOA security uniforms, their faces twisted with aggression as they demanded he remove his military cadet badge. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt as I watched from my car, still 50 yards away, my blood beginning to boil at what I was witnessing. Marcus stood there, calm and respectful despite being outnumbered, his hands at his sides as the lead enforcer. A man I'd later learn was Brad Henderson, Karen's newest lapdog, pointed his finger inches from my son's face. The boy had just returned from his junior ROTC summer camp, proudly wearing his dress uniform complete with the badge he'd earned through weeks of rigorous training and discipline. But these men didn't care about his accomplishments, didn't care about the pride in his eyes, didn't care about anything except flexing their borrowed authority. As I approached, I could hear Brad's voice rising above the others, demanding Marcus explain why he thought he was special enough to wear military insignia in their neighborhood. The other 2 enforcers, middle-aged men with badges that read community safety officers, stood with their arms crossed, creating an intimidating wall around my son. Marcus kept his composure, explaining politely that it was his ROTC uniform and he had every right to wear it, but his voice carried a slight tremor that only a father would notice. That tremor, that hint of fear in my boy's voice, was the moment something inside me shifted permanently. I parked my car and stepped out, my 22 years of military service automatically straightening my spine as I assessed the situation with the cold precision that had served me well in 3 combat deployments. "Gentlemen," I called out, my voice carrying the authority that comes from commanding troops in life-or-death situations. "Is there a problem here?" The 3 men turned toward me, and I could see the calculation in their eyes as they tried to determine whether I was a threat to their little power play. Brad, clearly the ringleader, puffed out his chest and informed me that my son was violating HOA regulations by wearing unauthorized military paraphernalia on community property. The absurdity of the statement hung in the air like smoke, but I kept my expression neutral, my hands relaxed at my sides. I'd learned long ago that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones who underestimated you, and these men had no idea what they were dealing with. They saw a quiet neighborhood dad in civilian clothes, not the decorated combat veteran who'd spent 2 decades learning how to dismantle corrupt power structures from the inside. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly know, was that their little harassment campaign had just painted a target on the back of someone who'd made a career out of strategic warfare. As I stood there listening to their pompous explanations and watching my son's jaw clench with barely contained indignation, I made a mental note of every word, every face, every detail. Karen Mitchell, the HOA president who'd orchestrated this confrontation from the safety of her air-conditioned office, had just made the biggest tactical error of her life. She'd attacked my family, crossed a line that should never be crossed, and she had absolutely no idea that she'd just declared war on someone who'd spent decades learning how to win battles that others couldn't even see coming. Have you ever dealt with an HOA power trip that went too far? Let me know in the comments, because what happened next changed everything for our entire neighborhood. Karen Mitchell wasn't just the HOA president of Sunset Ridge Community. He was a tyrant who'd turned our peaceful neighborhood into his personal kingdom through years of methodical intimidation and bureaucratic warfare. Standing barely 5'6" with perfectly manicured nails and an expensive suit that screamed, "I have lawyers on speed dial," Karen had transformed what should have been a simple homeowners association into a machine designed for one purpose: absolute control over every aspect of our lives. He'd moved into the neighborhood 5 years ago, immediately positioning himself as the champion of property values and community standards. But what he really championed was his own insatiable need to micromanage every blade of grass, every paint color, and every parking decision within a 2-mile radius. Within 18 months of his arrival, he'd systematically removed every reasonable board member and replaced them with yes-men who nodded approvingly at his increasingly ridiculous demands. The man operated like a corporate dictator, complete with a network of volunteer enforcers who patrolled the streets looking for violations that would justify his existence. His office, a converted garage that he'd somehow gotten approved for official HOA business, was filled with filing cabinets containing detailed records on every resident, every complaint, and every fine he'd ever issued. Karen maintained a database of infractions that read like a surveillance report, documenting everything from the day Mrs. Patterson's roses grew 2 inches over the approved height to the exact number of minutes the Johnson family's garbage can remain visible from the street. He'd installed security cameras at every entrance and hired Brad Henderson, a former mall security guard with delusions of grandeur, to serve as his chief enforcement officer. Together, they'd created an atmosphere where neighbors reported on neighbors, where children playing too loudly resulted in official warnings, and where the simple act of living became a minefield of potential violations. But Karen's true genius lay in his understanding of legal intimidation. He knew exactly how far he could push before crossing into illegal territory, and he danced along that line with the precision of a seasoned predator. His letters arrived on official letterhead, threatening legal action for violations so minor they bordered on parody. Grass maintained at 2.1 inches instead of the mandated 2 inches. Holiday decorations left up for 31 days instead of the approved 30, or car washing performed on unauthorized days of the week. He'd cultivated relationships with certain city officials, learning to weaponize municipal codes and zoning regulations to support his increasingly aggressive campaigns against anyone who dared question his authority. Residents who challenged him found themselves buried under an avalanche of inspections, citations, and legal threats that would cost thousands of dollars to fight, even when they were completely in the right. The psychological warfare was perhaps the most insidious aspect of Karen's operation. He understood that most people would rather comply than fight, especially when fighting meant risking their homes and financial security. He'd perfected the art of making life miserable for anyone who opposed him, using perfectly legal methods to create stress, anxiety, and financial pressure that would break down even the most determined resistance. His network of informants meant that nothing happened in the neighborhood without his knowledge, and he used that information to strike at the most vulnerable moments in people's lives. New parents found themselves facing violations for children's toys left in yards. Elderly residents received citations for maintenance issues they couldn't physically address, and working families discovered that any schedule conflict with HOA demands resulted in escalating fines that compounded weekly. What Karen Mitchell had built wasn't just an HOA. It was a perfectly legal extortion racket that had turned our community into his personal fiefdom, and he genuinely believed that his power made him untouchable. He had no idea that his campaign of harassment against my son had just brought him face-to-face with someone who'd spent decades learning how to dismantle exactly this kind of corrupt system. 3 days after the gate incident, Karen Mitchell made the decision that would ultimately destroy everything he'd built. He decided to make my son Marcus a specific target for systematic harassment, apparently believing that a teenage boy would be easier to intimidate than an adult who might fight back legally. The first escalation came in the form of an official letter delivered by certified mail, demanding that Marcus never again wear his ROTC uniform anywhere on community property, claiming it violated newly enacted regulations about non-resident military displays that Karen had obviously written specifically for this situation. The letter threatened immediate fines of $500 per day for any future violations, with the possibility of legal action to enforce compliance and recover costs. But Karen didn't stop with bureaucratic intimidation. He instructed his enforcement team to follow Marcus whenever the boy entered or left the community, documenting his activities and looking for any excuse to issue additional citations. The harassment became a daily routine that transformed my son's simple walk to the school bus into a gauntlet of uniformed men with clipboards and cameras, treating an honor student like a criminal suspect under constant surveillance. Brad Henderson seemed to take particular pleasure in the assignment, positioning himself strategically along Marcus's route and making a show of photographing any interaction the boy had with neighbors or friends. When Marcus wore his regular clothes, They found fault with his backpack being too military-style for community standards. When he helped elderly Mr. Rodriguez with his groceries, they issued a citation for unauthorized commercial activity on residential property. When he played basketball with friends at the community court, they shut down the facility, claiming excessive noise complaints that had mysteriously been filed moments after their arrival. But Karen's most catastrophic mistake came when he decided to involve the local police in his campaign of harassment, filing false reports claiming that Marcus was engaging in suspicious military-related activities that warranted investigation for potential security threats. The first police visit was handled professionally. The officers recognized immediately that they were dealing with harassment complaints rather than legitimate security concerns, and they documented their findings accordingly. However, Karen persisted, filing additional reports with increasingly dramatic language about unauthorized military personnel conducting unknown activities in residential areas. He seemed to believe that his position as HOA president gave his complaints extra credibility with law enforcement, not realizing that his pattern of false reports was creating a paper trail that would eventually be used against him. The breaking point came when Karen crossed the line from harassment into outright sabotage, apparently believing that escalating tactics would force us to move away and eliminate the problem of having someone willing to resist his authority. Using his network of maintenance contacts and his knowledge of community infrastructure, he arranged for our internet service to be mysteriously damaged during routine utility work, for our mail delivery to be disrupted due to address verification issues, and for our water pressure to drop dramatically due to aging pipes that somehow only affected our house. When these subtle attacks failed to produce the desired result, Karen made his most reckless decision yet. He contacted Marcus's school administration, claiming that the boys' military obsession and aggressive behavior toward community authority figures suggested potential violence that warranted intervention and monitoring. This final escalation revealed the true depth of Karen's arrogance and his complete misunderstanding of the forces he was dealing with. He'd moved from simple harassment into territory that threatened my son's education, his future military career, and his reputation in ways that could cause permanent damage. What Karen Mitchell didn't realize was that every phone call, every false report, every act of sabotage was being documented not just by his victims, but by law enforcement agencies and school officials who were growing increasingly frustrated with his abuse of their systems. He'd transformed himself from a petty neighborhood dictator into someone actively interfering with multiple government institutions, and his belief that his HOA position protected him from consequences was about to be tested in ways he never imagined possible. The man had declared total war against my family, using every tool at his disposal to try to destroy a teenage boy's life, and he was about to discover that he'd chosen the wrong enemy for this particular battle. What Karen Mitchell couldn't have known when he decided to target my family was that 22 years of military service had taught me something that most civilians never learn. The difference between winning a battle and winning a war is almost always patience, preparation, and the ability to think several moves ahead of your opponent. While he was busy with his daily harassment campaigns and petty power plays, I was quietly building something that would ultimately prove far more powerful than his entire network of enforcers and informants. I was building an airtight legal case that would expose every aspect of his corrupt operation to the exact people who had the authority to shut him down permanently. My first step was to treat this situation exactly like the intelligence operations I'd managed overseas. Establish clear objectives, identify all hostile actors, document every interaction, and gather evidence that would stand up to the highest possible scrutiny. The documentation process began immediately after the gate incident, with every interaction recorded, every letter photographed, every witness statement collected and dated. I installed discrete security cameras around our property, perfectly legal and explicitly allowed under HOA regulations that Karen himself had written, capturing not just the harassment of my son, but also the surveillance activities of Brad Henderson and his team as they conducted their daily patrols. What emerged from weeks of careful observation was a pattern of behavior that went far beyond simple neighborhood disputes. Karen's operation showed clear signs of systematic harassment, potential civil rights violations, and the kind of coordinated intimidation campaign that federal agencies take very seriously when properly documented. Every phone call was logged, every false police report was copied, and every interaction with school officials was recorded with their knowledge and consent. But my real secret weapon wasn't just documentation. It was my network of contacts built over 2 decades of military service, including relationships with lawyers who specialized in civil rights cases, investigators who understood how to build cases against corrupt officials, and military legal advocates who had specific experience dealing with discrimination against service members and their families. Through careful inquiries, I learned that Marcus's situation was protected under multiple federal laws that Karen had never bothered to research, including protections for family members of military personnel and specific regulations about interference with our ODC activities. More importantly, I discovered that Karen's false reports to police and school officials had crossed him over from civil harassment into criminal territory, where his HOA position provided no protection whatsoever. The investigation revealed layers of corruption that even I hadn't expected. Karen's financial management of HOA funds showed irregularities that warranted forensic accounting. His hiring practices for enforcement personnel violated multiple employment laws, and his surveillance activities had potentially crossed into illegal territory in several instances. Through Freedom of Information Act requests, I obtained copies of every police report he'd filed, every complaint he'd made to city officials, and every interaction he'd had with municipal authorities over the past 3 years. The pattern that emerged was one of systematic abuse of government resources, with Karen using tax-funded services as weapons in his personal vendettas against residents who challenged his authority. His mistake wasn't just harassing my son. It was creating a documented trail of misconduct that painted a clear picture of a man who'd forgotten that his authority had limits. Most importantly, I was building coalitions with other residents who'd been victims of Karen's harassment, but had been too intimidated or financially constrained to fight back individually. What I discovered was that nearly every family in the neighborhood had their own horror stories about Karen's tactics, their own collections of threatening letters and unreasonable demands, their own experiences with his enforcement team's intimidation campaigns. By treating each resident like a potential witness rather than just a neighbor, I was able to document a community-wide pattern of abuse that transformed individual complaints into a class action level case, with dozens of victims and hundreds of documented violations. Karen Mitchell thought he was fighting one family that had stepped out of line, but what he'd actually done was unite an entire community against him and provide a military-trained strategist with all the time and motivation needed to plan his complete downfall. He had no idea that every day he continued his harassment campaign, he was actually just adding more evidence to a case that would ultimately remove him from power and potentially send him to prison. The annual HOA meeting had always been Karen Mitchell's personal showcase, a carefully orchestrated performance where he presented his vision for the community while surrounded by his hand-picked board members and enforcement team, with residents relegated to the role of silent audience members who were expected to approve his decisions without question. This year's meeting was scheduled for the second Tuesday in August, held in the community center that Karen had renovated with HOA funds to include a raised platform where he could literally look down on the residents while delivering his annual address about property values, community standards, and the continued need for his leadership. He'd sent out the agenda 3 weeks in advance, as required by state law, listing the usual items: financial reports, upcoming projects, and rule modifications that would expand his authority even further. What wasn't on the agenda was the special presentation that I'd arranged through legal channels, a presentation that would expose every aspect of his corrupt operation to the entire community and several very interested observers. The meeting began exactly as Karen had planned, with approximately 60 residents filling the folding chairs while he stood behind his podium flanked by Brad Henderson and the other enforcement officers, creating the visual impression of authority backed by force. His opening remarks followed the familiar pattern of self-congratulation mixed with subtle threats, reminding everyone how his leadership had maintained property values and preserved community standards through firm but fair enforcement of regulations. He presented financial reports that showed HOA funds being used for security improvements and administrative necessities, though he glossed over the specific details with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged on his accounting practices. The residents sat quietly, as they'd been trained to do through years of intimidation, while Karen painted himself as the indispensable guardian of their investment and their safety. But when Karen called for questions from the community, usually a brief formality where no one dared to speak up, I stood from my seat in the back row and calmly requested permission to address several concerns about recent HOA activities and their legal implications. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as Karen's confident smile faltered slightly, though he quickly recovered and granted my request with the dismissive tone of someone who'd dealt with troublemakers before. What he didn't notice was that I'd brought several boxes of materials with me, or that there were now additional observers in the room who hadn't been there when the meeting started, observers with badges and legal authority who'd been invited to witness what was about to unfold. As I walked to the front of the room, I could see confusion and concern spreading across the faces of Karen's board members, who clearly hadn't expected this deviation from the usual script. I began my presentation by projecting a simple timeline onto the wall behind Karen's podium, a chronological display of every harassment incident, every false report, every act of sabotage that had occurred over the past 6 months, with dates, times, and photographic evidence for each entry. The room went completely silent as residents saw, for the first time, the full scope of the campaign that had been conducted against my family. But more importantly, they began to recognize patterns of behavior that had affected their own families as well. When I displayed the financial records showing how Karen had used HOA funds to pay for personal surveillance equipment and unauthorized legal fees, several board members actually gasped audibly. When I showed the documented evidence of false police reports and the official responses from law enforcement agencies who'd grown tired of being used as weapons in personal vendettas, I could see Karen's face beginning to flush with something that might have been panic. But the real moment of revelation came when I introduced the special observers who'd been quietly documenting everything from the back of the room. Representatives from the State Attorney General's office who'd been investigating complaints about HOA misconduct, IRS agents who'd received reports about potential financial irregularities, and local police detectives who'd been assigned to investigate the pattern of false reports that had been wasting department resources for months. As these officials stepped forward to identify themselves and explain their presence, I watched Karen Mitchell's world collapse in real time. His confident posture crumbled, his voice cracked as he tried to interrupt and regain control, and his enforcement team actually began backing away from him as they realized they'd been accessories to activities that were about to result in serious legal consequences. The man who'd spent years terrorizing residents with threats of legal action was suddenly facing the reality of actual law enforcement interest in his activities, and his desperate attempts to dismiss the evidence or claim misunderstandings only made his situation worse. The community that had lived in fear of his authority for so long was witnessing his complete humiliation in the most public forum possible, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. The weeks following the HOA meeting revelation became a cascading series of consequences that dismantled Karen Mitchell's entire operation with the methodical precision of a controlled demolition, each new development building on the previous one, until his complete destruction became inevitable and irreversible. Within 48 hours of the meeting, the State Attorney General's office had frozen all HOA accounts pending a full audit of financial records, effectively cutting off Karen's access to the funds he'd been using to finance his harassment campaigns and legal threats. The IRS investigation expanded from simple irregularities to potential tax fraud when forensic accountants discovered that Karen had been classifying personal expenses as business deductions while simultaneously claiming HOA reimbursements for the same items. Local police formally charged him with filing false reports, a misdemeanor that carried potential jail time and automatically triggered a review of every complaint he'd filed over the past 3 years. The civil lawsuit filed by my family became a class action case when 17 other families joined as plaintiffs, each bringing their own documented evidence of harassment, financial manipulation, and abuse of authority that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning nearly 5 years of Karen's leadership. The legal team I'd assembled included specialists in civil rights violations, HOA law, and government corruption, and they attacked Karen's operation from multiple angles simultaneously, pursuing criminal charges for his misconduct while also seeking financial damages that would bankrupt him personally and professionally. His insurance company declined to provide legal coverage after determining that his actions fell outside the scope of authorized HOA activities, leaving him to face mounting legal bills with his frozen assets and no external support system. But perhaps the most devastating blow came when the investigation revealed that several of Karen's enforcement officers, including Brad Henderson, had been operating without proper licensing or authority for security activities, making their surveillance and intimidation campaigns not just harassment, but potentially criminal impersonation of law enforcement officers. The discovery triggered additional investigations by state licensing boards and resulted in criminal charges that carried felony penalties, effectively ending the careers of everyone who'd participated in Karen's network of enforcers. The community surveillance system that Karen had installed using HOA funds was seized as evidence, and residents learned that much of their activity had been illegally monitored and recorded without their knowledge or consent. The financial investigation revealed the true scope of Karen's corruption. Over $200,000 in HOA funds had been misappropriated through fraudulent contracts, inflated service fees, and outright theft disguised as administrative expenses. The forensic audit showed that Karen had been systematically overcharging residents for services while pocketing the difference, creating fake vendor contracts with companies that didn't exist, and using HOA credit accounts for personal purchases that he'd hidden through falsified documentation. When the full extent of his financial crimes became public, several residents who'd been struggling to pay his inflated fees and excessive fines realized they'd been victims of what amounted to organized theft operating under the cover of legitimate HOA business. The final humiliation came when Karen's own legal troubles triggered investigations into every aspect of his personal and professional life, revealing additional misconduct that extended far beyond his HOA activities. His real estate license was suspended pending investigation of unethical practices in his business dealings. His professional certifications were revoked due to criminal charges, and his reputation in the local business community was completely destroyed by the publicity surrounding his arrest and prosecution. The man who'd spent years terrorizing residents with threats of legal action and financial ruin found himself facing potential prison time, bankruptcy, and the complete destruction of everything he'd built through decades of work. As he sat in county jail awaiting trial on multiple felony charges, unable to make bail due to his frozen assets, Karen Mitchell finally understood what it felt like to be powerless in the face of a system designed to crush him. Except, unlike his victims, he'd brought this destruction entirely upon himself through his own arrogance and criminal behavior. 6 months after Karen Mitchell's arrest, our neighborhood had transformed into something none of us had dared to imagine during the dark years of his reign. A genuine community where neighbors actually talked to each other instead of reporting violations, where children played outside without fear of harassment, and where the simple act of living in your own home no longer required navigating a minefield of arbitrary rules and petty enforcement. The new HOA board, elected in a special meeting that saw unprecedented resident participation, immediately voted to eliminate 90% of Karen's ridiculous regulations and redirect the organization's focus toward actual community improvement rather than surveillance and punishment. The enforcement team was disbanded entirely, with security responsibilities transferred to legitimate professionals who understood the difference between community safety and residential intimidation. The financial recovery process revealed additional surprises that turned Karen's corruption into unexpected benefits for every resident. Insurance settlements and recovered funds not only reimbursed all the excessive fees and fraudulent fines that Karen had collected over the years, but also provided enough surplus money to fund community improvements that residents had been requesting for years. The surveillance equipment that had been used to spy on families was repurposed into a legitimate security system focused on actual crime prevention, rather than rule enforcement. The community center that Karen had renovated to showcase his authority was redesigned as a genuine gathering place where residents could hold events, meetings, and social functions without fear of being monitored or reported. Marcus, my son who'd been the initial target of Karen's harassment, became something of a neighborhood hero when his courage in standing up to intimidation inspired other residents to share their own stories and join the fight for justice. His ROTC uniform, which had triggered the entire conflict, now symbolized the military values of honor, integrity, and service that had ultimately defeated corruption and restored justice to our community. The school investigation that Karen had initiated backfired completely when administrators discovered the harassment campaign and formally commended Marcus for his conduct throughout the ordeal. His college applications were strengthened rather than damaged by the experience, and several universities specifically noted his resilience and integrity when facing adult intimidation and abuse of authority. The legal aftermath continued to provide satisfaction as Karen's trials proceeded through the court system. He was ultimately convicted on multiple felony charges, including embezzlement, fraud, filing false reports, and civil rights violations that carried a combined sentence of 8 years in state prison. The civil lawsuit resulted in a judgment that not only compensated all the families he'd harassed, but also established legal precedents that would protect future residents from similar abuses of HOA authority. Brad Henderson and the other enforcement officers received sentences ranging from probation to 2 years in prison, and their convictions serve as a warning to other HOA boards about the legal risks of crossing the line from legitimate community management into harassment and intimidation. But the most poetic justice came in the form of the new community standards that emerged from the ashes of Karen's dictatorship. Standards based on mutual respect, democratic decision-making, and the understanding that a homeowners association exists to serve residents rather than control them. The weekly harassment patrols were replaced by monthly community barbecues. The threatening legal notices were replaced by friendly newsletters celebrating neighbor achievements. And the atmosphere of fear and suspicion was replaced by the kind of genuine community spirit that Karen had claimed to protect, but had actually been systematically destroying for years. As I sit on my front porch in the evening, watching Marcus play basketball with friends at the community court without worrying about noise complaints or uniform violations, I'm reminded that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's building something better than what your enemy tried to destroy. Our story became a case study in how communities can fight back against corrupt leadership, and I've received messages from HOA residents across the country who used our documentation methods and legal strategies to address similar problems in their own neighborhoods. The lesson we learned, and the lesson I always share with others facing HOA harassment, is that bullies like Karen Mitchell depend on isolation, intimidation, and the assumption that residents are too scared or too powerless to fight back effectively. But when you combine military strategic thinking with community organizing, legal expertise, and the moral clarity that comes from protecting your family, even the most entrenched corruption can be defeated. Have you ever had to deal with an HOA nightmare? Share your story in the comments. And remember, sometimes the quiet neighbor who doesn't make waves is exactly the person you don't want to mess with. As the initial shock of Karen Mitchell's arrest rippled through the community, what we thought was the end of our nightmare turned out to be only the beginning of a much larger investigation that would eventually expose a network of corruption spanning multiple HOA communities and municipal government offices throughout the county. The State Attorney General's office, initially focused on our single community's complaints, began receiving calls from residents in neighboring developments who recognized familiar patterns in news reports about Karen's prosecution. The same systematic harassment, the same financial irregularities, and remarkably, many of the same enforcement contractors and legal firms that had been used to intimidate residents across a dozen different HOA communities. What emerged was evidence of a coordinated operation that had been using HOA positions as fronts for systematic fraud and intimidation campaigns, affecting thousands of families across the region. The investigation expanded when forensic accountants discovered that Karen's financial crimes weren't limited to simple embezzlement. He'd been operating what amounted to a money laundering scheme using multiple HOA accounts to hide the true sources and destinations of hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent transactions. The network included corrupt contractors who submitted inflated bills for work that was never completed, legal firms that filed frivolous lawsuits to generate fees while splitting profits with HOA officials, and even municipal employees who'd been accepting bribes to expedite permits and ignore code violations for preferred developers. Bank records revealed a complex web of shell companies and fake vendor relationships that had been systematically draining HOA reserves while creating the appearance of legitimate community improvements and services. But the most disturbing discovery came when investigators found evidence that Karen surveillance and harassment tactics were being shared and coordinated between multiple HOA presidents through private online forums and monthly meetings disguised as community leadership seminars. These gatherings, funded by registration fees paid with HOA money, serve as training sessions where corrupt officials shared strategies for intimidating residents, hiding financial irregularities, and using legal threats to suppress opposition. The meetings included presentations on managing difficult residents, maximizing fine revenue, and building enforcement networks that read like instruction manuals for organized harassment campaigns. Documents seized from Karen's files showed that our neighborhood had been used as a testing ground for tactics that were then implemented in other communities, making my son's harassment part of a much larger pattern of systematic abuse. The scope of the corruption became clear when investigators discovered that several of the enforcement officers who'd harassed Marcus were actually traveling between different HOA communities, conducting similar intimidation campaigns under various job titles and company names. Brad Henderson, Karen's chief enforcer, had been working simultaneously for 6 different HOA boards while using the same surveillance equipment and intimidation tactics in each location, effectively running a mobile harassment operation that targeted any resident who dared to challenge corrupt leadership. The equipment itself had been purchased through fraudulent contracts that inflated costs by 300%, with the excess money flowing back to the officials who'd approved the purchases. Security cameras that should have cost $50,000 were billed at $150,000, with a difference split between Karen, Henderson, and the shell company that existed only on paper. When the full extent of the network was revealed, it became clear that Karen Mitchell hadn't been an isolated case of HOA corruption. He'd been a central figure in an organized criminal enterprise that had been systematically defrauding communities and terrorizing residents for nearly a decade. The investigation ultimately resulted in over 40 arrests, including HOA presidents, board members, contractors, lawyers, and municipal employees who'd participated in the scheme. Federal charges were filed under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, typically reserved for organized crime syndicates, reflecting the systematic nature of the conspiracy and the millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions that had been conducted across state lines. What had started as a father protecting his son from HOA harassment had uncovered one of the largest municipal corruption cases in state history, and the evidence we'd gathered during those early months of documentation became the foundation for a prosecution that would ultimately send dozens of people to federal prison and result in the complete restructuring of HOA oversight laws throughout the region. The prosecution of Karen Mitchell's corruption network attracted national media attention when legal experts realized that our case represented the first successful use of federal organized crime statutes against HOA officials, setting legal precedents that would fundamentally change how these organizations could be held accountable for abuse of authority. Major news networks sent investigative teams to document how a simple harassment incident involving a teenager's military uniform had ultimately exposed a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise, and our story became a symbol of how ordinary citizens could fight back against systematic corruption when they had the right knowledge, persistence, and legal support. The coverage sparked similar investigations in HOA communities across the country, with residents who've been suffering in silence finally finding the courage to report their own experiences with corrupt leadership and systematic harassment. Congressional hearings were initiated when the scope of the fraud became clear, with my family invited to testify about how HOA corruption affects military families and the broader implications for community governance throughout the United States. Marcus, now 18 and preparing for his military academy appointment, testified alongside me about the psychological impact of being targeted by adult authority figures and how the experience had actually strengthened his commitment to serving his country and protecting others from similar abuses of power. His testimony, delivered in his dress uniform with a badge that had triggered the entire conflict, became one of the most powerful moments in the hearings and helped drive bipartisan support for federal legislation regulating HOA operations and protecting residents' rights. The legal precedents established by our case led to the passage of the Homeowner Protection Act, federal legislation that created oversight mechanisms for HOA operations, established criminal penalties for financial fraud and harassment campaigns, and provided legal protections for residents who reported misconduct or challenged corrupt leadership. The law included specific provisions protecting military families from discrimination and harassment, ensuring that what happened to Marcus could never again be used as a weapon against service members or their children. State governments across the country began revising their HOA oversight laws, creating independent review boards, requiring financial audits, and establishing whistleblower protections that made it safer for residents to report abuse without fear of retaliation. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact came from the educational programs and resources that emerged from our experience. Legal aid organizations began offering specialized services for HOA dispute resolution. Community colleges started teaching courses on homeowner rights and HOA governance, and online resources were created to help residents document and report abuse effectively. The documentation methods I developed during our fight against Karen Mitchell became standard practices taught to residents nationwide, and the network of contacts I'd built through my military service evolved into a national organization providing support and resources to families facing HOA harassment. Military legal assistance offices began including HOA dispute resolution in their standard services, recognizing that housing discrimination and harassment were significant issues affecting service members and their families. The financial recovery program established as part of the prosecution returned over $12 million to affected families, while also funding community improvement projects that Karen's network had fraudulently billed but never completed. Swimming pools, playgrounds, and community centers that had existed only on paper in falsified construction contracts were actually built using recovered funds, transforming neighborhoods that had been drained by corruption into thriving communities with genuine amenities and services. The enforcement equipment that had been used for surveillance and intimidation was donated to schools and legitimate security companies, while the buildings that had housed Karen's operation were converted into community service centers offering legal aid, financial counseling, and conflict resolution services to residents throughout the region. The 2 years following Karen Mitchell's conviction transformed not just our neighborhood, but also my own understanding of how military leadership skills could be applied to civilian community organizing and social justice advocacy, leading me to establish a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping families fight HOA corruption and abuse of authority throughout the country. What had begun as a father's desperate attempt to protect his son from harassment evolved into a comprehensive program that combined military strategic planning with legal advocacy, community organizing, and public policy reform to address systematic problems affecting millions of American families. The organization, Veterans Against HOA Abuse, grew from a simple website sharing our documentation methods into a national network of volunteers providing direct assistance to families facing harassment, financial fraud, and civil rights violations at the hands of corrupt community leaders. Marcus, whose courage in standing up to adult intimidation had sparked the entire movement, completed his appointment to the military academy and chose to specialize in military law with a focus on civil rights and community protection, inspired by his experience to dedicate his career to ensuring that other families wouldn't face the same systematic harassment that had targeted our household. His academy thesis examined the intersection of military service and civilian community leadership, analyzing how the principles of honor, integrity, and service that guide military operations could be applied to civilian governance and community organizing. The young man who'd been targeted for wearing his ROTC uniform became a national spokesperson for military family rights and community justice, speaking at conferences and congressional hearings about the importance of protecting service members from discrimination and harassment. The ripple effects of our victory continued to generate positive changes throughout the region as corrupt HOA leaders either resigned in fear of investigation or were removed through resident-led reform movements that used our documentation methods and legal strategies to expose financial irregularities and abuse of authority in their own communities. The network of resources we developed became a template for community organizing that emphasized strategic planning, evidence gathering, and coalition building over emotional confrontation or individual complaints, proving that systematic problems required systematic solutions implemented through coordinated action rather than isolated resistance. Training programs I developed for community leaders drew participants from across the country, teaching military-style strategic planning techniques adapted for civilian community organizing and legal advocacy. But the most meaningful transformation was personal. The experience of fighting corruption and protecting my family had revealed capabilities and purposes that I'd never fully understood during my military career, showing me that the skills I developed in combat zones could be equally powerful when applied to domestic social justice and community protection. The calm strategic thinking that had served me well in dangerous overseas deployments proved essential for navigating complex legal systems, building evidence cases, and organizing community resistance to corrupt authority. The network of contacts and resources I'd built through decades of military service became the foundation for civilian advocacy work that ultimately helped hundreds of families and contributed to national policy reforms that would protect millions more. The speaking engagements, congressional testimony, and media interviews that followed our victory provided platforms to address broader issues of community governance, civilian-military relations, and the importance of applying military values like honor and integrity to civilian leadership roles. Military audiences were particularly receptive to presentations about how service members could use their training and experience to address community problems and protect other families from the kind of systematic harassment that had targeted our household. Civilian audiences learned about the strategic thinking and organizational skills that military training provides, and how those capabilities can be channeled into positive community leadership rather than simply individual career advancement. The story of how a teenager's military uniform had ultimately led to the exposure of a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise became a powerful example of how individual acts of courage can trigger systematic changes that benefit entire communities and influence national policy development. 5 years after Karen Mitchell's initial arrest, the continuing legal proceedings and investigations spawned by our case had fundamentally transformed HOA governance throughout the United States, with new federal and state regulations creating oversight mechanisms that made the kind of systematic corruption and harassment we'd experienced virtually impossible to sustain without detection and prosecution. The precedents established by our prosecution had been cited in over 200 additional cases across the country, resulting in the conviction of corrupt HOA officials, the recovery of millions of dollars in fraudulent charges, and the implementation of democratic reforms that return power to residents rather than self-appointed community dictators. Marcus, now a commissioned officer in the Military Legal Corps, had prosecuted several similar cases as part of his service, helping military families fight housing discrimination and community harassment while building a career dedicated to the intersection of military law and civilian rights protection. The monitoring and oversight systems established as part of the settlement agreements continued to generate positive results as independent auditors discovered additional financial irregularities in communities that had been connected to Karen's network, leading to further prosecutions and the recovery of funds that had been stolen through fraudulent contracts and inflated service fees. The transparency requirements implemented under the new regulations meant that HOA financial records, board meeting minutes, and enforcement actions were now subject to regular review by independent authorities, creating accountability mechanisms that prevented the kind of secretive operations that had allowed Karen to operate without oversight for nearly 5 years. Residents throughout the country had access to resources and legal protections that made it safer to report misconduct and challenge corrupt leadership without fear of retaliation or financial ruin. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was cultural. The story of how a military family had successfully fought HOA corruption through strategic documentation and legal advocacy had inspired similar resistance movements in communities facing different types of systematic abuse, from corporate landlord exploitation to municipal government corruption to school board misconduct. The methods we developed for gathering evidence, building coalitions, and presenting cases to authorities have been adapted for use in dozens of different contexts where ordinary citizens needed to hold powerful institutions accountable for abuse of authority. Military veterans throughout the country had found new purposes in civilian community organizing, applying their training and experience to domestic social justice issues and discovering that their service to country could continue through service to community in ways that created positive change for thousands of families. The educational programs and resources that had emerged from our experience have been integrated into military family support services, legal aid organizations, and community college curricula, ensuring that future generations of residents would have the knowledge and tools necessary to recognize and resist corruption before it could take root and cause systematic damage. The nonprofit organization I'd established had grown into a national network with regional chapters providing direct assistance to families while also monitoring HOA governance trends and advocating for continued policy reforms at state and federal levels. The annual conference brought together hundreds of community organizers, legal advocates, and policy experts to share strategies and coordinate efforts to address emerging threats to homeowner rights and community democracy. Karen Mitchell himself, serving his 8-year federal sentence in a minimum security prison, had become something of a cautionary tale within the federal correctional system, where his case was studied as an example of how white-collar criminals often fail to understand the consequences of their actions until it's too late to avoid prosecution and imprisonment. His appeals had been exhausted. His assets remained frozen pending the completion of civil restitution proceedings, and his professional reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed that he would never again be able to work in real estate, community management, or any position involving financial responsibility or public trust. The man who'd once controlled every aspect of our neighborhood through intimidation and harassment now spent his days in a federal facility, with his correspondence monitored and his activities restricted, experiencing firsthand the powerlessness he'd once inflicted on others. The poetic justice was complete. The neighborhood dictator who believed himself untouchable had been brought down by the very system he'd tried to manipulate, and the community he'd terrorized had not only survived his reign, but emerged stronger, more democratic, and better protected against future corruption than ever before. Today, as I sit in the same community center where Karen Mitchell once held court over his captive audience of intimidated residents, watching Marcus pin lieutenant's bars on his dress uniform, while surrounded by neighbors who've become genuine friends rather than suspicious informants, I'm struck by how completely our world has transformed from those dark days when a simple walk to the school bus required running a gauntlet of harassment and surveillance. The building itself tells the story of our community's journey. The raised platform, where Karen once loomed over residents, has been removed and replaced with comfortable seating arranged in circles that encourage discussion rather than dictation. The walls once covered with threatening notices about violations and fines now display community announcements about volunteer opportunities and neighborhood celebrations. And the atmosphere of fear and suspicion has been replaced by the kind of genuine democratic participation that makes communities strong and resilient. The ripple effects of our victory continue to generate positive changes throughout the country as new cases emerge regularly, where families use our documentation methods and legal strategies to fight similar corruption in their own communities, proving that what we achieved wasn't a unique circumstance, but rather a replicable model for how ordinary citizens can hold powerful institutions accountable when they have the right knowledge, resources, and determination to see justice through to completion. The Veterans Against HOA Abuse organization has assisted over 500 families in the past 3 years, with a success rate that reflects the power of combining military strategic thinking with civilian legal advocacy and community organizing. And the methods we developed in fighting Karen Mitchell have been adapted for use against corrupt school boards, municipal governments, and corporate landlords who prey on residents' fear and isolation to avoid accountability for their misconduct. Marcus, whose teenage courage in standing up to adult intimidation sparked this entire movement, has built a military legal career focused on protecting service members and their families from housing discrimination and community harassment. Using his personal experience with systematic abuse to understand how power imbalances can be used as weapons against vulnerable populations and how legal protections must be actively enforced rather than simply written into statutes and regulations. His work has contributed to policy reforms that strengthen protections for military families while also creating precedents that benefit civilian communities facing similar challenges, proving that individual acts of resistance can generate systematic changes that protect thousands of people who will never know the names of those who fought for their rights. The educational and advocacy work that emerged from our experience has fundamentally changed how HOA governance is understood and regulated throughout the United States, with new oversight mechanisms, transparency requirements, and resident protection laws creating accountability structures that make it much more difficult for corrupt officials to operate without detection and much easier for residents to challenge abuse without fear of retaliation. The resources and support networks we built have been institutionalized through nonprofit organizations, legal aid societies, and government agencies, ensuring that future families facing similar challenges will have access to the kind of assistance and expertise that we had to develop through trial and error during our own fight for justice. But perhaps the most important legacy is the demonstration that seemingly powerless individuals can successfully challenge systematic corruption when they approach the problem with strategic thinking, careful documentation, and the patience to build cases that will stand up to the highest levels of legal scrutiny, proving that David really can defeat Goliath when David has the right tools, the right strategy, and the moral clarity that comes from protecting family and community from abuse. The story of how a teenager's military uniform triggered the exposure of a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise has become a case study in effective resistance to institutional corruption. But more importantly, it's become proof that ordinary Americans retain the power to hold their leaders accountable when they're willing to do the work necessary to gather evidence, build coalitions, and pursue justice through legitimate legal channels rather than simply accepting abuse as an inevitable part of community life. As I watch the current HOA board, democratically elected and genuinely accountable to residents, conduct their monthly meeting with transparency, respect, and actual concern for community welfare, I'm reminded that the victory we achieved wasn't just about defeating one corrupt official, but about reclaiming the democratic principles that should govern all community institutions and ensuring that future generations will inherit neighborhoods where families can live without fear of harassment, where children can play without surveillance, and where community leadership serves residents rather than exploiting them. Have you ever had to fight corruption in your own community? Share your story in the comments below. And remember, sometimes the quietest neighbor who never causes trouble is exactly the person you don't want to underestimate, because they might just have the skills, the patience, and the determination to bring down your entire corrupt operation and rebuild something better in its place. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of abuse of authority, harassment, and the powerful dignity of military service. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of respect and to inspire a deeper appreciation for those who serve and protect our country.